This is a presentation on Prokofiev Piano Sonata No. 7, Opus 58 in B-flat major, also known as the Stalingrad Sonata. In it, I will give a brief history of Prokofiev's life, address cyclic ties between the three war sonatas, and present an overview of the 7th sonata. Prokofiev was born in Ukraine in 1891 and died in Moscow in 1953. From a very young age, he had a love for the piano and for music, which was instilled in him by his mother. Prokofiev wrote in his memoir about his mother, "Mother achieved the best possible performance of the pieces she studied, regarding this work with love, and she was interested in serious music only. This played a significant role in the evolution of my own musical taste. From birth I heard Beethoven and Chopin, and I remember at the age of 12 consciously despising light music." When Prokofiev was 5, he began piano lessons with his mother, and in 1904 began studying at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. From the years 1918 to 1927, Prokofiev spent some time living in the United States as well as different places in Europe. Prokofiev found little success in the United States because at the same time Rachmaninoff was living there, and so he was foreshadowed by the other Russian composer. In Europe, Prokofiev found greater success, but was still being overshadowed by Stravinsky. When Prokofiev chose to return to the USSR, it was at the same time that Shostakovich had fallen out of favor because of his opera Lady Macbeth of the Minsk district. Because of this, Prokofiev was able to find greater success in Russia and spent 3 months successfully touring the country. The 7th Piano Sonata was started in 1939 along with Piano Sonatas No. 6 and No. 8, the 7th Sonata being completed in 1942. At this time, government censorship of the arts was becoming more strict, and because of that, Prokofiev was being careful in his compositions in order to remain an important composer in the Soviet Union. Prokofiev wrote a tribute to Stalin, which was called Zdravitsa, which is commonly known by its English title, Hail to Stalin. After all of this happened, Prokofiev began work on the war sonatas, Sonatas 6, 7, and 8, which are considered by many to be a rebellion against the music he was kindly requested to compose by the Soviet Union. These sonatas are much more dissonant than what he had been composing for Stalin. Ironically, Sonata No. 7 received a Stalin Prize. In the summer of 1939, when Prokofiev began work on the war sonatas, Mira Mendelssohn, who would later become his second wife, said that she remembered that Prokofiev was reading Romain Rolland's book on Beethoven, and she thought that was what influenced his compositions at this time. Some of the influences were his use of cyclic motives for all 3 sonatas, as well as the Fate motive. Prokofiev's war sonatas also relate to the last 3 Beethoven sonatas, which were all conceived at the same time and carry a similar weight in the scope of both composers' piano works. This sonata was premiered in 1943 by Sviatoslav Richter in 1943 in Moscow. Richter loved it and learned it in only 4 days. He had this to say about the sonata. "Disorder and uncertainty reign. Man observes the raging of death, dealing forces, but what he lives for doesn't cease to exist. He feels, he loves. The fullness of what he is feeling reaches out toward others. He is together with the rest of mankind, protesting and suffering deeply with them in their common grief. Full of a will for victory, he makes a headlong running attack, clearing away all obstacles. He will become strong through struggle, expanding into a gigantic and life-affirming force." Richter wrote in his memoir how Prokofiev was so thrilled that Richter was excited about the 7th sonata that he invited Richter over to play it in his hotel room. The pedal was broken on the piano that Prokofiev had, so he decided to fix it. The two ended up knocking heads so that they saw stars. At the premiere, Richter received several curtain calls, and Prokofiev received an ovation as well. Some in the audience liked the sonata so much that they stayed after the performance to hear the work a second time. As I mentioned before, there are cyclic ties between all 3 war sonatas. The 3 ties are the Fate motive, which can be found in Beethoven's 5th Symphony, the dun 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 dun, and One of the other ties is split major and minor sonorities, which is the significance of major and minor thirds, as well as an A flat versus G motive, sometimes written enharmonically as G and G sharp. Here are some examples of the Fate motive that can be found in the first movement of each of the sonatas, and examples of the split major and minor sonorities, which is also found in the first movement of all three sonatas. And finally, the A flat and G motive, which is found in various movements of all three sonatas. My slides will be available later to view more closely. Okay, in the seventh sonata, each movement contains all three of the motives that tie the three sonatas together, further showing that this is very intentional writing by Prokofiev. Now for the first movement. The primary theme of the first movement is marked by frantic and rhythmic driving forces. It is very chaotic and disorganized, and the first theme specifically starts with loud cluster chords. The second theme is very beautiful, but not necessarily melodic, as the melody just kind of wanders aimlessly. It wouldn't be something that you would be able to sing along very well with. The development is much more chromatic, and while it's easy to identify the themes, it is very violent compared to the frantic primary theme in the exposition. As you can probably see, this sonata follows sonata allegro form, with one exception. In the recapitulation, the secondary theme appears first before the primary theme, so it's mostly in sonata allegro form. This also contains a very brief coda. Let's listen to the exposition. So one thing I forgot to mention is, as we're listening to this, see if you can notice the three cyclic motivic ties that can be found throughout the sonata. The first one that I'll point out being here is that relationship of thirds in major and minor sonorities. Now we will listen to the secondary theme, the more melodic theme, which is very sad but also very beautiful. Here's the first appearance of the Fate motive. As you can hear, as this theme weaves around, it really doesn't seem to have a purpose in being here other than just to create a sound world for us to experience. Here is where we start to transition out of the exposition into the development. It starts to become more and more frantic as we start driving towards the return of the primary theme that opens the development section. So here, it's easy to identify the primary theme, but it's also very easy to hear how different it is. there's a wider range of used in the piano, as well as larger chords and more octaves compared to the beginning. The second movement is much more diatonic compared to the first movement. It appears to be in ternary form with a brief A section and A prime, beginning at measure 125 for the first A and measure 98 for the second, with a very short coda. The middle section is much more expansive, more chromatic, and more developmental, which is not so much what you would expect of a ternary form. Let's listen to the beginning of the first theme, of the first A section. So here, it's immediately easy to see how different this is from the first movement, which is so frantic, to where we get to this more soulful, melodic, diatonic experience in the second movement. In this section, I've skipped ahead to the end of the B section of the second movement. I skipped right to the climax because I wanted to show how different and how much more developmental this section is, but to also show a brief glimpse into those major and minor sonorities that I mentioned earlier. So right here, we're alternating between E major and C minor triads. Finally, we will take a look at the third movement. This movement is much more toccata-like, very perpetual motion throughout the movement. It opens with a chordal theme with a left hand ostinato. The right hand is playing a B-flat major chord, while the left hand implies a B-flat minor, although it's spelled as B-flat and C-sharp instead of B-flat and D-flat, which is again showing that split major and minor sonority. There's also a lot of interplay between the A-flat and the G, so you're starting to see a connection of all of those thematic materials that have been used in the... This movement is in an arch form. We open with an A section followed by a B section, then a C section, which is then followed by B prime, A prime, and a coda. So it kind of works forward and then works in reverse. I'm only going to play the opening A section so that we can hear the main theme of this movement. I'll stop this here just because I only have 1 minute left. What I'll do is upload these slides for you to take a chance to look at if you would like to. There's a little bit more information about further things to look for in each of these movements, as well as within the 3 war sonatas. And that's it.